Can you hear us?
I can hear you now,
Okay.
Ms. Anderson. Yep.
My Lord, this afternoon we have a panel session with college principals from 4 colleges. We have Ms. Angela Cox, who's the Principal and Chief Executive of Ayrshire College. We have Mr. John Vincent, who's Principal and Chief Exec of Glasgow Clyde College. We have Lydia Roma, who is the Principal and Chief Executive of the University of Highlands and Islands North, West and Hebrides. And we have Ms. Stella McManus, who's the Principal and Chief Executive of South Lanarkshire College.
Very good. Well, welcome to you all. Thank you. You're going to be asked some questions, and when you're ready, Ms. van der Westerhuizen, on you go.
Thank you, my Lord. I'll perhaps ask you each in turn, perhaps starting with Ms. Cox, to give just confirm your full names and to give your role now during the pandemic, as well as an overview of any national remit that you held. So if we could start with Ms. Cox and work our way down the line, please.
Okay, my name's Angela Cox. I'm currently Principal and Chief Executive of Ayrshire College. During the pandemic, I was Principal and Chief Exec of Borders College. And at that time, I didn't have any national roles.
Thank you. Mr. Vincent.
So, John Vincent, Principal Chief Exec, Glasgow Clyde College, commenced in 2017 in that role, so throughout the pandemic was in the capacity of Principal. In 2022, for that year, I served on the Scottish Government's COVID Advisory Group for universities and colleges.
Thank you. Ms. Roma.
My name is Lydia Roma. I'm Principal and Chief Executive of UHI North, West and Hebrides, a college and that was created through merger on the 1st of August 2023 from UHI West Highland, UHI North Highland and UHI Outer Hebrides colleges. During the pandemic, I was Principal and Chief Executive of UHI West Highland. In terms of national remit, I was a joint chair of the Joint Articulation Forum with University Scotland, representing Colleges Scotland, and the subsequent Joint Articulation Group. And I also attended for Colleges Scotland, the Ministerial Leadership Group for COVID.
Thank you. And Ms. McManus, finally.
Good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Stella McManus. I'm currently Principal of South Lanarkshire College. During the pandemic, I returned to Scotland in January 21 to take up the post of Deputy Principal at the college at the time. And I held that position during the second lockdown period. At the time, I didn't have a national remit, but I was part of the COVID College Sector Leads Group, which was chaired by the Principal of West College Scotland.
Thank you very much. My Lord, I forgot to say at the beginning that there are Rule 8 responses lodged for each of the panellists. Perhaps, again, starting with Ms. Cox, there are 2, one from Ayrshire College and one from Borders College, where I understand Ms. Cox was previously. So the first one, the Ayrshire College reference is SCI AYRC XX 000001. And the one from Borders College is SCI BRD-CXX 000001. Then for Mr. Vincent, there is one on behalf of Glasgow Clyde College, and that is reference SCI GCCO XX, and then 000006. And then for Ms. Roma, there are 3, and that's in light of the merger that you referred to. So there are 3. There's one from Lewis Castle College, UHI, and that is SCI UOHXXX 000082. Then there's one from UHI West Highland, and that is SCI UOHXXX 000083. And then one from Northwest Highlands, NWH, and that is SCI UOHXXX 000054. And finally, there's one from South Lanarkshire College, and that is SCI SLCO XX 000001. Before we start with the topics that I'd like to cover today, could I please ask you again in turn just to give a brief overview of details such as your college size and location and number of campuses, broadly the demographics of your student populations, and the types of courses you offer. And again, if we could start perhaps with Ms. Cox and work our way down the line. Thank you.
Yes, so Borders College is a rural college located in the Scottish Borders. It's got 3 campuses in Galashiels, Hawick and Newtown St Boswells. It supports around 5,300 learners per year and delivers a number of outreach programmes because of the rural nature of the region. Ayrshire College again has 3 campuses covering North, South and East Ayrshire. It supports around 11,000 learners per year. 40% of those students come from SIMD 1 to 20 and just about 20% of those learners come from SIMD 1 to 10. We offer, at Ayrshire College, we offer a full range of provision, mainly applied technical vocational subjects, so lots of practical work, and the same would be said of the Borders as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Vincent.
Glasgow Clyde College is a large further and higher education college located in the suburbs of Glasgow across 3 campuses. We have annually about 17,000 students, supported by about 1,200 members of staff. We're primarily a vocational technical college. We do have some academic studies, but the heart of what we do is technical and vocational. And we also have quite a large modern apprenticeship portfolio as well. As our community, the communities where our colleges are located are in some of the more deprived parts of Scotland according to SIMD data. Half of my student population live in postcodes from SIMD 20. About a third of my student population is from SIMD 10. We have a particularly large cohort of students who are asylum seekers and refugees following ESOL programmes, and they have their own particular challenges in terms of engaging with education.
Thank you very much. And just for the benefit of anyone who may not know, ESOL that's English as a second language?
Yeah, English for speakers of other languages.
Thank you. Ms. Roma.
If I may start with UHI West Highland. UHI West Highland was a college of further and higher education, which is an assigned college to the University of the Highlands and Islands, who acts as regional strategic body for the Highlands and Islands region for further higher education and research funding purposes. The college is based in Lochaber, Skye and Wester Ross, covers a population of about 40,000, which is with the biggest kind of centre of population being Fort William, with about 11,000 people in the wider Fort William area, and the rest of the population is highly distributed over very rural and island locations. In terms of the provision of UHI West Highland, the range of provision covers all access level provision, with specific emphasis on access pathways, working with schools, the further and higher education, but also postgraduate taught and research activity, courtesy of being assigned to a university. Specific areas of specialism are in the outdoor and adventure area and in land-based and maritime areas, but also complemented by a wide range of vocational specialisms that are relevant to local employers. About a quarter of West Highlands activity for further education was vested in school college activity. For UHI North, West and Hebrides, kind of adding in the former UHI North Highland and Lewis Castle College or UHI Outer Hebrides colleges, the combined college covers about 9,000 students in total, covering a similar range of tertiary activity from access through to postgraduate taught, and with additional kind of emphasis on engineering, particularly energy engineering, and land-based specialisms in equestrian, gamekeeping, golf management, alongside health and social care, and business, tourism, hospitality, maritime skills courses. So a very wide-ranging provision. The geographic area of Fuachai, North Western Hebrides is bigger than the size of Wales and operates across 19 locations. So 10 of these were in the former West Highland, 5 were in the former Luce Castle College, and 4 in the former North Highland College.
Thank you very much. Finally, Ms McManus.
South Lanarkshire College is a medium-sized further education college situated in East Kilbride, which is in the South Lanarkshire Local Authority, which is the 5th largest local authority in Scotland. Like my colleagues, circa 18% of my students are from the top 20% SIMD areas in Scotland. We also somewhat provide similar programmes to circa 5,000 students for young people aged 16 to 18, adults which could be aged from 19 to 80. We have a modern apprenticeship provision. We have got provision for students with additional support needs also. It covers the vast majority of Scottish qualification levels across access programmes, senior phase, foundation apprenticeships, modern apprenticeships, Scottish widening access programmes, and further and higher education programmes also, as well as various unique industry-led qualifications and degree programmes. We also work with community learning development teams within the South Lanarkshire Local Authority, and we provide progression pathways for students with who are speakers of English as a second or other language, and we help them, support them onto mainstream college courses as well.
Thank you very much. So the intention of today's panel is really to try and hear about some of the key impacts and issues experienced by students, staff and colleges, and hoping to do that under a number of broad themes, and that's time permitting. Hopefully we can discuss issues and impacts relating to, firstly, the initial closure of colleges. Secondly, issues around the move to remote and online learning and the experience of that. Subject-specific impacts, including impacts in relation to apprenticeships. Mental health, well-being and social impacts. Fifthly, assessments, attainments, classifications and new admissions, any specific issues you'd like to highlight around those. Then reopening of colleges and return to face-to-face learning. And then seventhly, impacts on colleges and staff. And then if there is time, potential lessons to be learned, that hopefully have an opportunity to make any suggestions for what the Scottish Government could do or reasonably do to mitigate some of the ongoing impacts you might be experiencing, and also what they could potentially do differently in future in the event of another pandemic. So we'll try and move our way through as many of those as possible in the time available, but as I said, we've got your Rule 8 responses anyway, so if there's anything we don't cover, all of that will still be taken into account. The inquiry is also particularly interested in disproportionate impacts on particular cohorts of students, which I think all of you represent students that would fall within that description. There won't be a lot time for a standalone discussion, but as that probably relates to a number of the topics that we'll hopefully cover today, if there are specific issues that you want to raise at any particular time in relation to disproportionate impacts on particular cohorts, please feel free to include that in the discussion. I think the time taken to cover each of the themes is likely to vary, so we'll see how we get on with the first few, but we may want a little bit more time on things like subject-specific impacts, given that you will have practical elements to the courses you offer, and possibly to the reopening of colleges, so we'll allocate a little bit of extra time to both of those. But if we could perhaps start with the closure of colleges, and just in the discussion we can include things or whatever you want to touch on, but decisions to close, any prior consultation and or guidance received from the Scottish Government, things like immediate practical issues for colleges, immediate impacts for students, particularly in relation to social cohesion, and the community role that colleges play, and any disproportionate impacts on particular cohorts of students or any other relevant key issues that you have in mind. And I think we can perhaps just start with Ms. Cox for this one and move our way down the line.
So in the run-up to Borders College closing on the 23rd of March, we picked up most of our intelligence and what was happening second and third hand. Principals were meeting almost on a daily basis online by that time to try and understand what was going on. There was a conversation where one of our principal colleagues explained that someone within his college had caught COVID, and the decision then had been made for that college to close immediately. When the individual contacted the Minister for Colleges at that time, he'd been told that sounds like a good idea. So that evening, college principals all came away and decided we were going to close our college. Colleges are not designed to deliver learning remotely, so there were really practical implications in terms of resource kit and equipment for people to be able to deliver learning from home. The nature of colleges is that we provide a community for people. So it wasn't just about the learning, it was the support that colleges provide. So most colleges provide students free breakfast and lunches, for example. Sometimes the college is a safe space for individuals to come to. So that was quite difficult, having to close the doors so quickly. Also in the run-up to the college closing, we had started to say to staff and students if they felt vulnerable not to come in to college. And I just remember feeling that weight of responsibility as a leader responsible for around 350 staff, over 5,000 students at that time, in terms of making the right decision for them. And on reflection, it would have been good to have some of that clarity and leadership from Scottish Government in terms of what we should have been doing rather than working it out for themselves, which is what in effect happened.
Thank you very much, Ms Cox. Mr Vincent.
Thank you. And many of the things that Angela said there, I'd echo. Our timeline was slightly different in Glasgow. I certainly don't recall any direction, correspondence or support from the Scottish Government or from the Scottish Funding Council, our primary funder, to help us reach that decision. Being in Glasgow, we've got 5 universities and HEIs operating that were all also in correspondence talking about the unfolding events. The 3 colleges, of which mine's one, were also in regular communication, and we came to a decision because we were experiencing students who were becoming ill, and we believed that to be with COVID. That was certainly what we were being told, that we should close. So we closed as Glasgow colleges on the 20th of March, close to students. We remained open for 2 or 3 days thereafter to deal with the logistics of supporting staff to be able to work from home and do remote learning. It's obviously very difficult to close campuses as well. They're huge assets, very complicated assets, with lots of systems that require maintenance and support, even if there aren't students on site. So that was an enormous challenge. I have to say, I felt as a principal we were making decisions about closing major community facilities with an element of risk, because it was bound to heighten public tension. It certainly heightened tension within our staff, our 1,200 staff. As soon as we said we weren't serving students, they of course were extremely worried about being on site themselves. So a very, very challenging period.
Thank you. And I should add, in my head, I have closure in inverted commas because obviously you couldn't close the campuses altogether. So feel free to highlight any particular aspects of or challenges with that as well, and any understanding or lack thereof.
Well, I just say I think we took an interpretation, certainly as the first lockdown happened, that was really what we should be doing, is completely closing campuses, and that was logistically hugely difficult. We had members of staff who were required to continue to support learners, and I have to say from the outset, did an astonishingly good job, both teachers and non-teaching staff, an astonishingly good job of that. But they were doing it from home, often without necessarily all the equipment or broadband access that they would need. It would have been considerably easier had some of them been able to access facilities in college, but our particular interpretation was, and eventually when government guidance came out, it was, we weren't operating in a hybrid sense initially. We were closed, and that was very, very challenging.
Thank you very much. Ms. Roma?
Yeah, probably slightly different context in terms of our operating environment from my colleagues here, in that we had in UHI West Highland 10 rural centres. So our staff and our students were distributed over multiple locations, and as part of UHI we also had part of our operation already operating our learning and teaching operating through an online hybrid model. But operating in a very fragile rural and island economy with high proportion of elderly residents in the community, and a real concern what the college's role would be potentially with younger people in college as a potential source of infection for that elderly community, and communities without a robust health infrastructure and acute lack of critical beds, for instance, should COVID really grip into these communities. So we as a college kind of saw the pandemic coming closer to our shores, and from the end of January as a college we instituted our business continuity protocol and engaged with College of Scotland and colleagues on both in the college as well as in the university sector through University of Highlands and Islands on intelligence and what should be the best course of action. And like my colleagues, we decided to close in tandem with the rest of the college sector in March. In the run-up to that closing down, we very much prepared our students for an online learning scenario. So building on the experience that we already had, we issued devices, but we also had to issue data in form of dongles, and basically issued all that we had in terms of equipment. We also front-loaded assessment before our students left. But with staff, like John has said, some skeleton staff had to be retained in college, both for IT and estates maintenance, in line with statutory requirements. But for IT, it was absolutely crucial that our IT infrastructure was able to be serviced after closure. And we also maintained some facility for students who had absolutely no safe place to study at home. So those cases we knew through our student support services who needed critical support, we maintained that support on campus even during the initial full closures. But we also had to advise our staff, including risk assessments for working from home, ensuring data security working from home, issuing them with appropriate equipment, making sure their mortgages kind of weren't breached and mortgage conditions to work from home. So there was a plethora of additional work for which, as my colleagues have said, there was absolutely no guidance from government. But we I think successfully managed what was a very complex area, and at the time we didn't really know what was to come. I closed my college thinking we would be back within 6 weeks.
And of course, yeah, as we know, it was a lot longer. Well, thank you very much. Ms. McManus, I'm conscious that you weren't in position at the time, but is there anything you'd like to add to that based on discussions with your colleagues who were around at the time?
I would like to concur with everything that sort of my colleagues have said, and I had been in the English sector at the time for the first lockdown, but based on the feedback from colleagues at South Lancashire, very similar to Lydia as well and to John and Angela, that the digital infrastructure was key. So you had staff that were very scared and students that were very scared, who were on hand to support other staff members and students to make sure that they had equipment at home from which we could swiftly move to online learning. And I think it's just to reiterate what colleagues have said, is that colleges were not set up for online learning. We just weren't. We are, we offer the vast majority of what we do is technical vocational qualifications. Thinking about carpentry and joinery, for example, how do you teach that online? How do you do that? And that was the real challenge. So you had staff going home to work in an environment that they had no experience of, staff themselves becoming more isolated, and then staff having to then work to prepare materials, to prepare online lessons. And that was a real challenge. And there was no guidance on that at all. And I think really that the other thing that Lydia has touched on as well is around, we closed our campuses, and we did do a hard closure once we got the initial infrastructure out. College campuses, to make everywhere, they are safe spaces. And that's something that was quite telling because of the number of students that we serve from those challenging areas, if you like, who have got their own barriers to learning that none of us potentially could possibly imagine. They were going to a home that perhaps wasn't a home as some of us know, and for them to learn in that environment, it wasn't suitable to learn. And that was a challenge in itself, excuse me, and resulted in additional staff support to be put in place, and staff working with those students. Again, not with any clear guidance on that. So, yeah, an exceptionally challenging time with which the staff at my college and like all other colleges cope with superbly.
Thank you very much. The next theme I have, and I think we've touched on it already because it was obviously in the forefront of all your minds as you moved into lockdown, is the move to remote and online learning and some of the challenges around that, some of which you've touched on already, as for example levels of preparedness of your individual colleges, digital inclusion or digital poverty in relation to both students and staff, and what that meant. Obviously devices is one aspect of it, but we've heard there's a multitude of aspects to that. Additional equipment required for any particular subjects, student engagement, impacts on staff and students, disproportionate impacts on any particular cohorts of student, and any other relevant key issues relating to that move and delivery of online and remote learning. So perhaps if we could start with Ms. Roma this time, followed by Mr. Vincent, then Ms. Cox, and then Ms. McManus.
Yes, thank you. I mean, bearing in mind that the UHI situation is perhaps slightly different in that part of UHI's portfolio of courses has been for a long time delivered in a hybrid mode, both online but supported through our centres of study. We were perhaps in a slightly more advantageous situation kind of approaching this scenario, but I would concur with my colleagues that as a whole we are not prepared to operate like effectively the Open University. It's a very different model in UHI compared to that. But we were forced to effectively close our physical campuses and move all of our activities online, and we were not prepared wholesale for that. So even my college, areas that were mentioned, engineering, construction, fabrication, welding, hospitality, hairdressing, all practical activities, had to be reinvented, and learning and teaching as well as assessment had to be thought of as online activity. So preparing students for that was key. Preparing staff for that was the other equation. And in a rural and island environment, both staff and students have the issue of infrastructure for connectivity. So staff would live in places where there were no spots in terms of broadband coverage, and that had to be managed to enable them to continue to teach. Students quite often, either in rented premises where they were living away from home, or in term time accommodation, didn't have access to reliable Wi-Fi or broadband to maintain their
their studies, so they had to be issued with not just with devices but also data, you know, and the cost of that had to be covered by the college. There was a huge logistics effort to get keep all students studying and to ensure all staff had the relevant equipment to continue. And then a whole new operating model had to be effectively developed immediately. So students' particular disadvantage were those who had a practical learning experience and a practical learning environment, students who in the workplace, so apprentices, I think, those who have placements as part of their course experience, that all disappeared overnight. And students with additional support needs, and also those cohorts that we have for students with profound and complex needs, who normally kind of are the most vulnerable of the student groups that we also cater for. Research staff and students were also impacted on because effectively their field work was cut off. So we had to compensate for that in various ways as we reinvented our operating model kind of over subsequent weeks and months. Again, we had to do so very much and from our own resources, although colleges, also through College Development Network, then started to share best practice that they had available and also materials. But there's perhaps another story about, how over... As the first lockdown in particular extended over a much longer time, how assessment of courses had to be reinvented, in that environment. But isolation, loneliness, mental health, dealing with, with having sometimes kids at home, kind of school age that had to be homeschooled, whilst also working and delivering learning to students, all of that became extremely difficult in that situation.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Vincent, if I could turn to you next, please.
Certainly, thank you. I think my college had very limited experience of teaching or facilitating learning remotely. One or two courses we had as distance learning electronically, but nothing like the scale of then trying to transition 17,000 students into learning from their bedrooms or kitchen tables. And I think it's a really important point to make with this is none of that learning assessment takes place without the staff preparing the materials and running those lessons, and they were often in less than ideal circumstances themselves, and it was hugely at a personal level revealing for me the digital poverty that many of our students and indeed staff live in. They may carry smartphones, but they don't have the sort of broadband connections that many of us would assume they have, and particularly in a college that serves some very, very deprived communities, there aren't the digital devices at home that you could study on. They might have a mobile phone with a very small data allowance. So that created an enormous challenge for us to get devices out of the dorm. We effectively took every digital device in the college and gave it to staff, and then started to roll them out to students, to buy as many digital devices as we possibly could. But of course we were buying them in an environment that everybody was buying digital devices. So that took not just weeks but months to receive the sorts of volumes. We started to, as Lydia's already said, hand out broadband connections, dongles, so that people could get that Wi-Fi connection so they could study. And of course they were studying in situations at home where many other siblings, mums, dads, brothers, sisters, aunts and uncles, all living in the same space, all trying to work and study at the same time with limited numbers of devices. It was an extremely challenging environment to be working in. I think in the first part of the pandemic, there may have been some slight advantage to the fact that we were 2/3 through the academic year. A lot of content had been delivered at that point. That made assessment and some of the practical studies very, very challenging, has already been identified, difficult to do remotely. But it also made it very difficult for our students to transition from, if you like, an in-person taught model which we had prepared them for and they were familiar with, to one within 2 or 3 days, where they were, sat with a device they were unfamiliar with digital skills that were maybe not as good as they should have been, in a home with a broadband that was not robust enough to support the size of documents they were needing to work on.
Thank you very much. Ms. Cox on remote and online learning, if I could turn to you then.
So as others have said, neither Borders College nor Ayrshire College were prepared to go to a full online learning model due to the nature of the programmes that are run in both of those colleges. Any online learning had been to enhance the already in-person applied practical learning that was in place. And I think what really struck me, particularly in Borders, was the digital poverty around connectivity. So many of our students, even although we gave them laptops, actually didn't have the connectivity to connect, and they were going out to try and find spaces that had connectivity to connect with us. And like others said, households were busy, and sometimes we handed out devices, but those devices were then used for school learning. And we were asking staff to deliver learning, but they were also trying to homeschool, and they didn't have the skill set to develop online learning that was engaging and impactful, actually. So increasingly our students, we found, were not putting their cameras on. Sometimes that is because of where they were connecting in from, and they were embarrassed about the background that they had. Sometimes it was because they weren't fully engaged and there was lots of other things going on at home. I think students with additional educational needs really struggled. They may be able to connect, but they were used to having that wraparound support in person in college. So you may have had a face on a screen, but those sense checks that would take place in person just weren't there, and that was particularly tough for those students. And then there was the whole welfare piece in terms of staff becoming concerned about the welfare of students and not being able to engage with them in the way that they once did, because there was a screen of faces and you can't have that one-to-one conversation with someone when that happens. The other thing I would say is our staff worked really, really hard to try and make it work, very conscientious about keeping students engaged. But students slowly turned day into night, and it sort of became 24-hour, questions coming through at all times of days and night, and it took us a little while to actually put in some boundaries to say, actually, you need to work within this time period. So I think it was very impactful for our students, because they didn't gain that college experience and social maturity development that colleges provide, but it was equally impactful in a negative way, I think, for our staff.
Thank you very much. Finally, Ms McManus, please.
Similar really to what my colleagues have said, the digital infrastructure piece was key. We gave out, similar to John, gave out every laptop that we owned within the college with no idea if we'd get it back or not. That was the type of, we probably still lost some of them. We had also, similar to John, that when we were trying to order new laptops, we had waiting lists. So at that point, then that meant students were becoming more isolated and falling behind in their learning. So which was challenging. I think the thing that Angela's touched on, which I'd wanted to bring in, was the student engagement piece. That was difficult because doing online learning properly takes skill. And it's not to say that our lecturers weren't skilled in doing that, but they weren't used to doing that, and that was new to them. So having a lecturer to suddenly overnight flip to an online methodology pedagogy, which was new to them, was very challenging. That took research for them. So they're developing new materials while still trying to keep learners engaged, motivated, who are scared, and coming from environments which aren't necessarily always suitable to learning, was a real challenge, and it was a real strain on staff. So we were working with our trade unions ourselves, trying to establish guidelines for staff. And as Angela touched on as well, you know, that students were contacting our staff day and night, and it wasn't just about learning, it was about other issues that they were going through, because at that point, you know, the wraparound support services couldn't cope. And that's what the colleges did. They were there to provide that pastoral care as well. So it was a real challenge. And I think that we also do a lot of senior phase work, and that's working with schools as well. So schools are working in one manner, colleges are working in a different manner, and that's sometimes conflicted. And the student engagement, so that engagement of students was difficult. Students were maybe dropping off their learning, you know, and it was a worry as to why they weren't engaging. And then the other real challenge as well was, which I'm sure we will come on to, is around how we were ensuring, you know, that our students were still going to attain their qualifications, how they were going to pass them, as John has already touched on, because we were sort of 2/3 through the year, then a lot of the practical stuff had been done, so we could get more students through. But there was still an element of, well, colleges were locked down from that sort of last bit of the sort of academic year. So how were the awarding bodies that we all work with going to help us deal with that? And then that would then result in implications for progressions onto their future courses as well. So, so the online piece just became something, I think, that for all of us, that our staff dealt with tremendously well, our students as well. But I think the main thing to highlight was the impact on the students in terms of their uncertainty of how they were going to achieve their qualifications, and the staff impact of how they were trying to keep up and make sure that the students were going to achieve the qualifications as well. So it was a sort of a bit of a double-edged sword as well.
Thank you very much. The next on my list is subject-specific impacts, and I think if we'd have a bit of a discussion around including impacts on apprenticeships, in particular modern apprenticeships, deferrals, impacts on practical and vocational subjects, and any other relevant key issues around this. And I'm going to ask Mr. Vincent to start, because he has a particular interest in apprenticeships. And if I could please ask you also to just give a broad outline of the different types of apprenticeships that there are, that colleges offer, and then discuss some of the challenges around apprenticeships, followed by any subject-specific challenges as well. I think your college offers, for example, I think it's the only place to offer stringed instruments, if my memory serves me correctly. So if I could ask you to start and to focus primarily on apprenticeships, and then feel free to touch on other practical subjects. And then if we could follow Mr. Vincent with Ms. Roma, Ms. Cox, and then Ms. McManus, please.
Thank you. So yes, I'll focus my comments on apprenticeships, because I'm sure others will reflect the diversity of their curriculum. There are three different types of apprenticeships that operate in Scotland. There are foundation apprenticeships, which is largely a school, college or school training provider product. There is a modern apprenticeship, and there's a graduate apprenticeship. Modern apprenticeships are largely a college or private training provider delivered product. Graduate apprenticeships tends to be a university or higher education product. It's really important not to necessarily confuse those three different types of apprenticeships. In the modern apprenticeship, which is by far the biggest in terms of volume of candidates, every modern apprentice is an employee. They're employed by an organisation as a member of their staff, and they are doing a training programme, an apprenticeship with an educational centre. And that means the relationship with the college is quite different from that of a normal student. They are an employee, they have contractual work commitments. Those apprentices are studying in a diverse array of subjects, from admin, hairdressing, complementary therapies, to horticulture and engineering and construction, you name it, across the sort of trades and professions. There's an apprenticeship, modern apprenticeship in it. During the pandemic, it was extremely challenging for apprentices. They had situations where significant numbers of them were furloughed. And it took a very long time to gain clarification as to whether a person on furlough could continue to do their apprenticeship studies. And so during that period, there were no studies taking place because nobody wanted to jeopardise the furloughed status. We also had issues with being able to access those particular students because they're not necessarily living in the localities of the colleges. Some of them will come on a block release basis to study at a college because it has a particular specialism and then return back to where they live or where their employer is based. So you didn't have, in effect, they weren't in your community, so access to them was really challenging. And I think as the pandemic went on, and maybe a point we'll touch on later, a tension began to emerge with apprentices because often the occupational sector in which they worked had started to open up and re-engage, but us as providers were being encouraged not to. Yeah. So those people, and they're both young people and adults, were out on building sites, were in engineering settings or hairdressing or beauty salons, continuing to learn their trade. What we couldn't do was to effectively support them with the underpinning knowledge or indeed go out and do the practical assessments. That made it very difficult for everybody involved and actually made it very difficult for us because it was difficult to understand some of the sense around why it was okay to be an apprentice working in a hair salon, but you couldn't come into the college to undertake theoretical studies related to that. So, and that was something we were asked to manage, and that was a very difficult thing to do. I think also some of the very specialist nature of apprenticeship studies, so maybe in gas fitting or electrical installations, means that the assessments they take have to take place in highly specialised, highly regulated workshop environments. And our ability to be able to get those students in to go through those studies that would enable them to complete their apprenticeships, regardless of their skill level or how long they'd been on the apprenticeship, that was massively delayed. And there were serious consequences to that. There were consequences to employers, because when a person becomes a fully qualified apprentice, they can start to go out and do jobs independently. And it also delayed the progression of those people from being apprentices to becoming fully qualified tradespeople, and the earnings that would mean, the difference it would make to their lives. That was largely as a consequence of just the limited capacities and access that we had to facilities to be able to put them through those sorts of regulated assessments. You were right in your comment earlier. My college enjoys being the only college in the UK to do lutherie studies, the manufacturing of stringed instruments, and I'm sure this will be a sort of point that others might pick up. There are some subjects that have a theoretical element and a practical element, and you can maybe with the scheduling of it bring forward theoretical elements that can be taught distance or remotely. The physical making of a stringed instrument is a uniquely practical skill, and actually we've got lots of courses across our colleges that are uniquely practical skills. You run out of things that you can do remotely, and students simply don't have access to the sorts of specialist equipment that is unique to our settings, and those facilities were closed.
Thank you very much. I think Ms. Roma.
Yeah, I don't want to repeat what John so eloquently has just outlined, but I'd like to highlight, the early years and health and social care courses in particular, where, actually within a COVID environment, there was a real need for that workforce, that qualifying workforce, and what John has outlined, and the inability for us to, to assess SVQs and apprenticeships, the inability for us to access, childcare providers and health and social care providers even after they opened again. Really kind of deprived those sectors most in need of workforce from that workforce actually entering in the most qualified way. So that's I think that's a point to emphasise. In my college, particularly the areas that had practical and land-based kind of elements, were probably most affected, as I presume they would have been in all other colleges. So for construction, rural skills courses, engineering courses, in the first part of the pandemic in 2019-20, as we've said, probably kind of completion of courses was less impacted on, because the practical elements in the run-up to the full college closure were front-loaded. So it was a question of completing more of the academic underpinning online elements. But it was difficult nevertheless for those cohorts, because those students really quite often just come because of the practical nature of the courses and learn better in that practical environment. So everything we've outlined about moving to online learning, would have particularly played out in those courses. Outdoor adventure in my context, attracting students into a centre of excellence, a School of Adventure Studies. Those students quite often were also in term time accommodation, coming from other parts of Scotland and the UK, and were effectively marooned in their sometimes quite inadequate term time accommodation, and didn't understand why the outdoor part, the outdoor classroom, couldn't be used in a much more effective way. And probably similar things applied to in the other colleges to equestrian students, golf students, where the outdoor classroom could have been really utilised much more effectively. It had a significant impact in those areas on recruitment in 2020-21, because colleges were considered to be closed for business because of that hard closure in the early phase of the pandemic. So students who would come to college looking for practical activities didn't feel they had a pathway into that, and that followed through in 2020-21, and then also subsequently kind of in other areas. So in addition, business, tourism, hospitality, particularly professional cookery, beauty, creative arts, textiles, fashion, music, maritime skills, they all kind of were similarly affected. We had to become very innovative in how we simulated practical activities online, and also in the later phase of the pandemic, how we brought students in small cohorts into practical facilities and learning contexts, observing the various kind of rules for social distancing. I think one point that Stella made earlier, there were different rules on social distancing impacting on schools as well as colleges and universities, or then the corresponding commercial kind of activities. So as John had said, in a hairdressing salon, that was opened with different rules from a hairdressing salon in a college, kind of in the pandemic, and it really there were much harsher rules applied to the college environment than to a commercial environment or leisure environment even, and it was hard to replicate why that reasoning had been undertaken, because outbreaks really were not coming out of the college environments throughout that 2-year period.
Thank you. Just before we move on, you mentioned outdoor classrooms, and we may come on to discuss that later, but what do you mean by that? Is that a physical space outdoors where or practical sessions happen, or is it just having engagement outdoors?
So with rural and outdoor courses, a lot of the instruction for skills takes place in the outdoors, in an outdoor space, which obviously is unencumbered by by some of the issues that affected indoor spaces in terms of the virus transmission, but that wasn't factored in at all in any of the guidelines. So but for instance, travelling to an outdoor space where instruction would take place, there was no way to transport students in a minibus, for instance, because of the social distancing rules. So students had to make their own way, sometimes, cycling kind of in for long distances to get to their places of instruction. And so the rules kind of for particular subject areas just did not make a lot of sense, and they were quite frustrating both for students and staff. We had to work around all of that in order to achieve successful completion, but quite often completion of a course, particularly after academic year 1920, had to take place in the next year, hoping for more relaxation of the rules.
Thank you very much. Ms. Cox, do you have anything to add on subject-specific impacts? And also, please feel free also to touch on apprenticeships if that's something you offer.
So, so in addition to what colleagues have already said, we did have a situation where a number of apprenticeships or apprentices actually lost their role because there was delays in them being able to carry out the full remit of their job. So young people were impacted by those delays in terms of not being able to secure full-time employment at the end of the apprenticeship programme. The other thing I wanted to highlight, and Lydia's already mentioned about childcare and health and social care, there was a slightly different approach taken with the university sector, where there had been some sort of COVID insurance licence that allowed university health and social care and health students to carry out work experience within the health sector, and clearly there was a great demand for those types of roles, whereas college students were treated differently during that period, despite doing similar types of qualification and jobs. And likewise with outdoor pursuits such as agriculture, you know, boat building, outdoor classrooms, you know, if we had been given more discretion in terms of how we managed and planned that, more of those students would have been able to progress in their studies more quickly. And there was a need, particularly in the borders around farming, you know, they were calling out for those students to progress quickly so that they could be in industry more quickly, fully qualified. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Ms. McManus, and again, equally practical subjects, and if you have anything to add in relation to apprenticeships.
Sure. So my college, despite being a sort of medium-sized college, has quite a large modern apprenticeship cohort as well, the vast majority of which is within the construction area. And as John has touched on, obviously for some of those courses like the plumbing and gas, the gas regulated quals are quite important in terms of health and safety, so have to be carried out in terms of under specific conditions. I think really just to bring some sort of light to this as well, so what we had found is that because the students couldn't obviously complete their qualification in that time, or they couldn't progress on to the next year, that meant that we had to defer students. So roughly 16% of our students, which were mainly the construction related students, so whether those were the modern apprentices or whether they were doing the pure sort of college construction courses, they were deferred into the next year. And then so that meant that when you came into the sort of 2021 sort of year, you had this backup. So you've got staff who are working to try and complete last year's students who are deferred, and then to deal with the new intake as well. So that was a real challenge, a real difficulty. So and I think that you'll probably come on to this as well, but I think that the biggest challenge around this as well was we were all trying to, as college leaders, trying to work out what to do in these circumstances and give advice to our learning and teaching staff. But the guidance coming from the awarding bodies around how we manage this was probably slower than we would have wished for. So we were trying to fill that sort of gap ourselves. So what Angela's touched on as well is of particular relevance to my college around areas like health and social care and childhood practice. Health and social care is one of the largest skills gaps within my local authority, if not, you know, and also in Scotland. So that what this was meaning that if you students who were completing, you know, a year or 2 year course, then they were delayed from getting out into the workforce and supporting with the pandemic and then the aftermath of the pandemic as well. So that was a real issue. So, but areas that we all deliver in terms of that technical delivery, things around you know, the hair, beauty, the construction aspects, the childhood practice piece, all those courses that had that practical element, as John has touched on, they would literally stop. And so staff are finding things to do with them because they couldn't progress, and they couldn't progress because we weren't sure how we were able to help those students continue, because we were left almost a little bit hanging, if you like, because the awarding bodies were also dealing with challenging circumstances, of course, and that was something that it was hard. And also, just to make it very clear that where a university will award their own degrees, colleges are answerable to a myriad of awarding bodies, from Scottish Qualifications Authority to people like City and Guilds. So there's a myriad of them that we have to answer to, and each of them would have had slightly differing advice and guidance as well.
Thank you very much. I'm just wondering, my lord, we have 2 hours set aside. We need to take a 15-minute break for the stenographer. We can either move on, but I think maybe if we take a break now, we've got more than 50% left, but I don't think it'll take more than 50% of the time. So perhaps if we take a 15-minute break now and come
Very
back.
good. We'll come back at 3 o'clock then.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon again, my lord.
Good afternoon, Ms van der Westhuizen. When you're ready then.
Thank you very much. My lord, I'm going to change the order slightly from what I'd outlined at the beginning because we are moving into assessments, attainments and classifications and new admissions. So I'm going to switch that around and we'll do mental health and wellbeing after that. So if I could pick up now, perhaps starting with Ms McManus, followed by Ms Roma, followed by Mr Vincent, and then Ms Cox. Just have a brief discussion about assessments, attainments and classifications and new admissions and issues and impacts relating to that. For example, the fact that you've already touched on the issue with the multiple awarding bodies, a lack of flexibility in the assessment processes, lack of understanding potentially if that was an issue by decision makers of what a college does, and any other impacts such as school grades on college admissions, a deferral of students and backlogs, and any other relevant key issues. So if I could ask you to start, Ms McManus, please.
Sure. So I think if we start from the point really of the sort of first initial lockdown, and I think because it was a bit of a sort of journey to use that term. So we had deferrals because we couldn't complete students from the previous year, and we were waiting on guidance from the main awarding body that a lot of us will use in Scotland, is the Scottish Qualifications Authority, and that guidance was slow. Once that guidance was received, it was, what was challenging was that we all had to develop a new quality assurance and holistic assessment model to ensure that the integrity of the qualifications remained, and that was key because we have to make sure that we are meeting both the awarding body standards and the national occupational standards as well. So that meant that that our quality teams, if you like, the pressure put on them was tremendous. And I think that unlike the university sector, we don't have large quality units. We might have one or two people within a quality team. So a lot of the pressure on sort of developing the approach to how we're doing quality assurance would start with them and then would roll out towards a lot of our academic teaching teams. So we had challenges as well because unlike some of the other awarding bodies, SQA don't have an online e-portfolio system, which is sort of a bit old-fashioned, really. I think is something that, if we're talking about lessons learned approach, that would be good to have that, because that would have a sort of record of all of the progress of the students, which was more easily accessible as well. So what that meant with developing this new holistic assessment model was, once the development of it, making sure that SQA were happy with it, training the staff was also exceptionally important as well. So that was really key, and also then the staff having to adapt the assessments themselves that they were doing with the students. So again, teaching differently in order to try and make sure the students could get through those qualifications. So that was a challenge as well. And then so you had that sort of deferral piece there, and then you would have when we were looking to sort of bring students back onto campus, etc. as well. There was a lack of a sort of a joined up approach, I felt, between Scottish Government and SQA, because we were using, or the terminology that was being given to us was things like an enhanced restricted learning teaching, and it was a lack of understanding what that really meant, and also a request on what comprises things like critical assessment of our students as well. So that was one of the sort of challenging things as well. And then in preparation for the work we were doing in sort of the second year, and when we're starting to reopen, we were having to sort of bring in students that were from practical qualifications. Mm-hmm. So that then meant that the students who perhaps weren't on a sort of practical element were still at home and still being isolated, because the 5% rule meant you were trying to prioritise those students with the practical qualifications to get them through their qualifications, and the ones from the sort of previous years as well. So it was that challenge really, especially. So you felt that the assessment model didn't really move quickly enough, really, in that space.
Thank you very much. Ms Roma.
Yeah, I think adding and following on from this, it's fair to say that as a college sector, I think we counted it at the time, we had 100 different awarding bodies that we had to make the amended assessment arrangements for that Stella has just outlined. The largest by far is SQA, but there were 99 others, other awarding bodies that we had to deal with across all of the college sector's kind of delivery. And I think that fact alone and the effort that went into all of that, both at principal level with the agencies themselves, but also, our staff, that was entirely underestimated by decision makers. As far as SQA, national qualifications and changes to assessment arrangements went, the focus was entirely on schools as the main users of those qualifications, but colleges are the second largest user of national qualifications, and through school college activity but also standalone college activity are users of those qualifications, and the needs of college students and the ability of college staff to design and verify assessments, which is different from teaching staff in schools. That wasn't well handled, particularly in the early phase of the pandemic running up to the first certification date in August 2020. As Stella has said, for those subjects that would have normally had an exam diet, that was suspended, and the effort that was required for the holistic alternative assessment and the verification kind of that internally, and then the administration of effectively sending all the assessment evidence to SQA, which had to be paper-based with wet signatures in full lockdown period. That was a huge administrative effort. We weren't allowed to use online methods for delivering that assessment evidence to SQA. But the effort of our staff was not recognised in the same way as the parallel effort was recognised in schools with additional payments to teaching staff who had to undertake that. So there were two very different approaches taken to the secondary and the post-school college sector over arrangements for the same qualifications issued by SQA. I think it's fair to say that over the whole period of the 2 years part of this inquiry, there were different sort of phases of how all of this played out, and later on, certainly, I think the issue of managing practical students and students online with the very kind of restrictive sort of attendance modes that we were allowed to take students and staff onto campus meant that we lost a lot of students kind of in terms of retention, and then subsequently attainment rates absolutely dropped in my college and for the sector as a whole. I think there was also consequences of kind of particularly the assessment effort that was teacher-led instead of exams. That led to more students achieving in the school sector, but also in the college sector, and FE students as well as school students then articulating for the academic year 2020-21 into university as opposed to college. So rather than taking up HNC, HND studies in college, a lot of students went on the basis of those initial assessments and results into universities, and perhaps kind of with inflated grades at that point. So there were unintended consequences in 2020-21 and onwards. The college sector lost a lot of HNC, HND entrants from school, or more school leavers who might have come to college opted to stay another year in school because of the experience that they had. But I think on the whole, I think the issue was that our main sort of qualification bodies and government with it did not understand the range of qualifications that the college sector operates and the needs of college students and staff in that period.
Thank you very much. Mr. Vincent, we can turn to you next.
Thank you. Just to expand on the point about awarding bodies, in some qualifications, there's not only an awarding body, but there's a standard setting or a regulatory body involved as well. And that's particularly the case in apprenticeships, but it does in other qualifications. So sometimes it was not just the awarding body that was slow to respond to the very acute needs that we had of students coming to the end of their studies very soon. But sometimes it was the regulatory body, and quite rightly they have a standard which a plumber, an electrician, whatever, a mechanical engineer must achieve, and there needed to be some flexibility in that space, and that took a long time for that guidance to come out. I think I'll pick up on the teacher assessment, often when external examinations weren't undertaken. And that undoubtedly did lead to some grade inflation, and the consequences of grade inflation are that students progress onto qualifications that may normally have been beyond their level of normal attainment. And frequently, across the pandemic, we saw some awarding bodies allowing a reduction in the content of qualifications because they accepted the challenge of delivering that. What that meant was there was some key bits of learning missing. So students were progressing to maybe a higher level than they'd normally attain, but with larger chunks of learning missing. And that did few any great favours. And I think if we look back across both student retention, i.e. do they start courses and stay to the end, and students' attainment, i.e. do they actually pass. My own college example would be retention wasn't as good across the pandemic as it had been. Students became disengaged, and that may have been for a whole variety of reasons, but that could also include the remote learning and many of the things that were going on in their lives. And they also didn't they didn't pass at the levels that they did before. There was much greater partial attainment. They didn't complete the qualifications. And we were certainly getting into situations where students were finding the study much harder than they should have done. And we also had the tension, which was of the economic market. You know, we're in a post-Brexit scenario where there was a very tight labour market, and we had students who were relatively well qualified in skills and trades, not fully qualified but skilled, who were having job opportunities available to them. And so we were seeing students coming away from their studies at a much later stage than we'd normally observe because they were going into the employment market. And that, of course, a great shame for them because they had to return back at a later point to finish their qualifications, but important, undoubtedly, to their household finances that they were doing so.
Thank you very much. And finally, Ms. Cox.
Yeah, so just building on the point that SQA really understood and focused on schools, and there was a lack of understanding really in terms of colleges. Colleges were first given guidance around national qualifications on Friday the 3rd of April, 8 working days after schools had their guidance given. That was on the Friday evening that lecturers finished for their spring break. It took until June and July for the full range of other guidance to come from SQA for college staff to work through that assessment, which was very, very stressful for staff and students who were asking about where their sort of qualifications or course sign-off was. I think the other thing, and John's touched on this, that the messaging was very different on national qualifications for school pupils, where they were told that schools were not required to undertake any further assessment from March 2020, but the guidance for college qualifications were that students should continue to participate in learning and assessment opportunities until such time as sufficient evidence was in place. That has led to gaps in learning, and I think we saw that even after the pandemic with young people coming through to college who didn't have the full knowledge that we would expect for the courses that they were going on. And just touching on the HNC, HND piece, where increased places were given to universities to deal with the inflated grades that were coming out from schools. It meant that colleges' HND provision dropped from 25% of all of our provision as a sector to 10%. That has a direct impact on workforce because people are staying 2 additional years in study when they could be out in the workplace contributing to the economy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If we could move on then to discuss impacts and issues around mental health and well-being and more widely social impacts, please. So we can include discussion, for example, on mental health, social maturity, social anxiety, support offered, any disproportionate impacts on particular cohorts of students, and any other relevant key issues that you'd wish to raise. And I think the order we can take this in, please, given your national remit, is to please start with Mr. Vincent, and then followed by Ms. Cox, and then Ms. McManus, and then Ms. Roma. So if we could start with you, Mr. Vincent, please.
Thank you. Colleges are extremely adept at dealing with our students experiencing low-level and much more serious mental health issues, from anxiety to crisis to having chronic disabilities related to mental health. And we manage that in a variety of ways normally, from an embedded model of members of staff being mental health first aiders or being able to offer pastoral support and care, through to qualified counsellors being able to offer slots. And of course, it's not in the least bit unusual that a student studying a course will see an awful lot of a teacher or a support worker and will develop a close relationship with them, and they'll be able to support them with both their academic needs but also their emotional needs. Mm-hmm. Of course, in lockdown, that was completely lost. And it happened very quickly, and we were very unfamiliar with how we would navigate that space at a time when people's mental health, both staff and students, was becoming more and more vulnerable. For a variety of reasons, the isolation, the trauma, the worries about their financial situations. That led to an awfully difficult situation for staff trying to manage groups of students that they could see through online lessons and through communications who were deeply struggling. We also had our own staff who were deeply struggling in that time, torn very much between their own domestic challenges and trying to support students. Colleges, in my opinion, did a very good job of transitioning support, particularly the more formalised counselling type work, into an online model, often doing counselling sessions through things like Zoom and Teams. But that dealt with a relatively small proportion of students who were experiencing trauma of some kind. And it was very much a tip of an iceberg that was growing rapidly across that period. And as we found both pre-pandemic, during pandemic and post-pandemic, the ability of NHS primary care to deal with the volumes of people that are experiencing mental health difficulties, there's a big gap there. Colleges have often helped to plug that gap with our staff. That was exceptionally challenging during that period. Whilst we did receive some additional funding from the Scottish Government during the pandemic for mental health activity, it nowhere near came close to the scale of the challenge that we were trying to surmount. Just on the social impacts, two student groups I'd just like to identify for you. One is one I mentioned at the beginning, those students who are studying English for speakers of other languages. They're often asylum seekers or migrants. They come to us with sometimes no English language skills, or certainly extremely limited English language skills. The nature of the lockdown meant that those students were being asked to study from home, but had probably no access to digital equipment, weren't able to speak or read our language, and often the staff that teach them not just teach them the language, but support them in many aspects of their lives as they're assimilating into our society. So it's not in the least bit unusual they bring in welfare forms and ask them to be explained or help to fill them in. And those students struggled enormously in terms of engagement with our society because they were isolated. The other group, special educational needs students, who of course are not only learning the content of a course, but so important is the social element of them gaining more independence as they become older. That social independence was an enormous challenge because they were studying remotely from home, and that's slightly counter to the point of their college courses, which is about making them more independent and potentially more employable. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. Cox, if we can turn to you then.
Yeah, so, you know, I concur with everything that John has said, but I think the other thing is the sort of long tail of COVID and what it's left in terms of that mental resilience of our students and our staff members, that there is a state of sort of constant anxiety and nervousness around any sort of change, and in some cases I would say a lack of tolerance. And at the same time we have newer cohorts of students coming through who are socially immature, unable to communicate in a way that we would have expected perhaps before COVID, and that social connectivity across different cohorts of students not really reaching out and being proactive in terms of engaging with people that they perhaps don't know. So I do think there is a societal impact there, and yet we aren't supported with that growing need to support the mental resilience of our staff and students. We're asking staff to deal with a very different environment in terms of the people that we are supporting through the college. And then colleges are communities where we provide welfare support but also well-being support, and Ayrshire College, you know, sporting facilities open every evening, free, targeting around particular cohorts of students perhaps recovering drug and alcohol addicts. All of that went during COVID, so it does feel in some cases we're starting again with some of those marginalised communities in the area that we serve.
Thank you. Ms. McManus, if we could come to you then, please.
Thank you. I think I completely agree with what John and Angela have outlined. I think there's the two groups, you know, obviously our students and our staff really here. I think just to give some context as well, is a lot of our student population, if you like, is our adults. So only a small part of what we do is, you know, sort of younger provision. So in my case, at my college, the vast majority of my students are aged 25 and over. So they have families and home lives of their own. So for us, really, we found that referrals exploded. You know, we became overwhelmed with the amount of referrals, as John has already outlined, because the local services just couldn't cope, really. I think that the other thing to sort of bear in mind, it was a variety of things. You know, it was complex support needs. It was things from, you know, families struggling with homeschooling, keeping in touch with their workplaces, finance issues, you know, the challenges of rising debt, relationship issues, and in some cases there were domestic abuse issues because that home environment was not a safe place for them. So the counselling service had to support students for longer periods. At our college, you would typically have 6 counselling sessions, but there was no way that you could stop supporting an individual you know, after these 6 sessions, because there was nowhere for them to be referred on to. As John had mentioned, we did get Scottish Government support, but our referrals has increased by circa 20% in 1920. As Angela has alluded to as well, we are still dealing with the impact. And if you bear in mind that, you know, we are not just preparing students, you know, John's touched on this as well, for a job with a qualification. It's about them developing the additional skills to sort of exist in society. Everything, you know, curiosity, teamworking, listening skills, all of these things are factors. And we were having to also teach and work with people to help them develop resilience skills. So we were teaching resilience workshops and trying to show people how they could cope with what was happening. And I think really, and I think the challenge we have now is obviously the counselling sort of funding for that. We now don't have that in the same way, but we're still dealing with that at the moment. For our staff really, and my college will be no different from what Angela, John and Lydia have gone through. We introduced, a vast range of measures on our own. We were working with our trade unions, things like, health and wellbeing guides for staff. We were doing online exercise classes, we were doing, mindfulness sessions, we had lots of information there to try and support staff become more resilient also. And I think that, we had to do a lot of mentoring, coaching support to our staff. I mean, all of us did this, no matter which role you sort of played within the college. And that was all done by ourselves. I think that's something to really focus on, that you're in a college community, and it was great to have the support of the other colleges, but we were all dealing with this on our own and putting things together on our own as well. We were sharing and supporting, but each college maybe has slightly different needs or issues as well that we were dealing with.
Thank you. And finally, Ms. Roma.
Yeah, I think my colleagues have, kind of very articulately kind of outlined what all colleges kind of had to deal with in this situation. So I'll just maybe highlight a couple of extra points. The government were talking a lot about balance of harms during this period, and I think the evidence that my colleagues have given, which also applies to my college, shows that that probably that balance of harms was imbalanced because of what was already sort of a mental health crisis prior to the COVID pandemic, just spiralling effectively out of control. Combination of all the factors that my colleagues have outlined, but really kind of largely driven by if we go back to actually as we experienced it, the incredible burden of uncertainty, what was to come. I mean, no one really knew what was going to happen at any one time, so there was a strong focus on government and the expert, health. The health experts, kind of the waiting for a vaccine. Nobody knew when it was going to end. So it was a roller coaster of emotions, and the burden on staff to provide the duty of care for students in their care, absolutely spiraled. Sometimes 24/7, kind of that staff were being as trusted kind of contacts were accessed by students, and that placed an incredible burden on staff themselves, who also dealt with similar kind of issues kind of and pressures in their own family and home environments. Perhaps a group of students that hasn't been mentioned is international students who are living away from home and in student accommodation. Much was made of that student group in the university sector, but perhaps in the college sector we had a number of colleges, including my own, attracting students who lived either abroad or far away from home within the UK. And those students for extended period of times had to live effectively isolated, and we had to support those students in a great deal, kind of finding online social activities to keep them socially engaged, in some cases ensuring that they had enough to eat, delivering food parcels. There was Christmas period, particularly in 2021, where we had students who were not able to travel home, and students kind of cut off from their home environment were a particular risk. I'm sad to say that in this period we had one suicide, and in the Lochabe area in particular we have quite unfortunately high suicide statistics, but whenever an event like that occurs, the whole community kind of is absolutely shocked and in mourning. So we had that on top of everything else. I think subsequent to the pandemic, and the Commissioner for Fair Access at the time, Sir Peter Scott, spoke very articulately in his reports about that. There is there's the biggest impact in terms of mental health was on those students who were most deprived and experienced poverty and had the least agency to deal with the circumstances. And that has, from school onwards, has kind of had a major impact on subsequent generations of students who we are still dealing with. So Sir Peter Scott talked about scarring that, of the generations affected by COVID and lockdown in particular, kind of following through their learning lives. And we still see this. And in some cases, we get school leavers coming into college now who display not just mental health issues, but also where that turns into aggressive behaviour. And, the rise of aggressive behaviour is not just an issue in schools these days, it's also an issue in colleges and universities. And having had a loss of that social element of learning, the mental health funding is now no longer available to us. That was, but the mental health issues certainly kind of continue to be at the same level or an increased level than they were during the pandemic. So, and I think perhaps the mental health support that colleges were able to provide and that students and staff have become accustomed to, that support and the funding for that perhaps has been discontinued too soon.
Thank you very much. If we could then turn to issues and impacts around reopening of colleges and return to face-to-face learning, and we can include, for example, issues around repeated closures and reopenings, a perceived lack of trust of colleges, a lack of understanding of the roles of colleges, prioritisation on reopening, differences in rules and guidance for example, Scotland compared with other parts of the UK across different parts of Scotland. We've touched on this already for colleges compared to with schools, and for colleges compared with other sectors in society. Practical consequences of applying particular rules and guidance to colleges. For example, I think one of you mentioned the 5% rule, already issues with getting staff and or students to return to campus, and any other of those or any other relevant key issues you'd like to touch on. And perhaps if we could start this round with Ms McManus, followed by Ms Cox, then Mr Vincent, and then Ms Roma.
Thank you. So I think for me, really, just my starting point would have been, just to give some context again, is I had moved from London to Scotland in sort of December 2020, January 21, and I'd left a college in London that was fully open. The whole student cohort was in, so to come back to Scotland and think, why aren't there many students in colleges? I couldn't quite understand that. And then obviously from the January 21 period, then we were told we had to shut down again for the second lockdown. So that was something that was a lot easier, if you like, because of what we had been through in the previous March as well. So that was a much more fluid. So we were probably more able to cope with a lot of the challenges, but everything that we have outlined previously was still real and present, we were still dealing with the isolated students, the mental health challenges, and a real fear, because I think, as Lydia's touched on, was that it was this feeling of, is this what it's going to be like? Are we going to just have to shut down and open it? How is this going to work? And I think really one of the first, I suppose for me, really being sort of new to the Scottish sector, real sort of eye-opening experiences was when, we were told when we could gradually start to reopen, and this was where the 5% rule came in. And I know that Colleges England had pretty much been bringing students back in, and we were, obviously I understand people were taking it slowly, and I completely understand that concern. But I think for me, really, this is when there was a clear lack of understanding about what college did, because we were prescribed in Arbitrary, you can bring in 5% of your provision, but there was no real recognition about the number of campuses colleges had, the size of the buildings, and what that actually looked like and what that meant. So I have a vague memory of sitting in a sort of COVID sector lease meeting and always going, well, what are you doing? What are you doing? What are you? And this was the discussions we had, and it was something that we were thinking, going, what does this mean? So in my situation, you know, I could bring in about 150 students, or, you know, roughly, and you were looking at bringing in those who were the most vulnerable students. They had to come in first. They were a priority, so that's what we did. Then obviously it was the students with the practical elements of the course, as I already mentioned as well. But the social anxiety was very real, the fear was real, and that was for both staff and students. So while there were some staff that were really clamouring to come back in and we were holding them back, much to their frustration, there were other staff that were scared to come in. They had families that they felt were still vulnerable, and that was something that we were really conscious of. We were then working in a situation where I would be leading on my sort of COVID planning team at the college. We would be doing all our risk assessment piece, you know, the health and safety, but we did all of that ourselves. Our teams, our facilities team did everything ourselves. We reconfigured our campuses to put in partition walls. We were knocking down walls. The financial cost of that is something we've never really recovered from, if I'm quite honest. You know, we had everything from additional PPE equipment being delivered. Yes, a lot of that was sort of paid for as well from Scottish Government, given funding for, but we were still going above and beyond what we felt we had to do in order to make our staff safe. The other challenge of that as well is that I think it's no secret that the college sector is quite unionised in terms of industrial relations. We work hard to have positive relations with our main trade unions. But rightly so, you know, trade unions are representing the views of their members, and a lot of that was fear. So you're having to sort of navigate, you know, the Scottish Government advice, translating that into what you thought was appropriate and right to the college, being exceptionally safe in terms of the campus buildings, and then having to potentially deal with unions that may have had different links into different people and had information potentially before that you had. So it was a really sort of confusing time, and it didn't feel as if there was a single point of contact for the college sector at times. And I think the other challenge that we had is that we were bringing 5% of our provision, a really small amount of students, and then we still had to do things, and then when that grew a little larger, we still had to do social distancing within the college sector, but schools didn't. So schools had students back in classrooms, but we had to have a two metre rule, if you like, that we were all very much aware of. You know, it was, you sort of think back, and I think back to my facilities teams walking about the college, marking out two metres within classrooms, so a lecturer could stand in this space, students couldn't cross this space. If they stayed in this area, then they didn't have to wear face masks. You know, it was that level of detail to give you a really detailed example of what we were actually going through here. And I think that, you know, everything from the risk assessments, reporting, the standard of health and safety that we have at colleges is very high. Each of us have a legislative responsibility to make sure health and safety is robust. And I think that was really galling, that when you had hair and beauty salons open up, and our hair and beauties are sat at home but could go and work in a salon but couldn't come into the college to do a practical assessment on live clients, that was a real challenge in itself. So it was difficult to try and keep your students motivated and explain to sort of stakeholders about why you're having to follow the rules you did. And I think the other thing is that all of us work with schools. We have great partnerships with our local authorities, and having to explain to them, actually, well, we can't bring in the senior phase students in this way, even though the schools can, and parents are not understanding it. So it was just a confusing time. But again, you know, going back to the professionalism and the work of our staff, it was incredible. And despite what were, you know, the restrictions placed on us, we were able to get our students through qualifications. But it did create, I felt, unnecessary tensions at times between different stakeholders and groups as well.
Thank you. Ms Cox, if I can come to you then, please.
So I think the fact that we had a sort of 5% rule across 24 institutions really showed me that there is a complete lack of understanding of how colleges operate and what we actually do, taking into account what others have already said in terms of the different size and makeup of our campuses, high volumes of work that are actually done outdoors or within the workplace, and the type of students that we work with. And for me, as a principal and chief exec, I perceived there to be a lack of trust in terms of my ability, and I'm going to say expertise and knowledge to make those right decisions for my staff and my students and the community that we serve. And building on what Stella said, you know, we have very experienced staff who specialise in health and safety, want the best for our staff and students, and we're being prescribed to in terms of how we had to operate as a business. And that wasn't the same for schools and universities. And it comes back to, I think, because actually people didn't understand what colleges did. So we had situations where in the borders around 500 senior phase students not understanding social distancing because they didn't have to do it in the school, and Borders College was the only provider of computing and IT qualifications in the senior phase in the Borders, so they needed to continue with that work. And there were more flexibilities again within the university sector. The other challenge particularly highlighted from Ayrshire College was when a tiered system was introduced, and there was different criteria when you've got 3 campuses over 3 local authorities, and the notion that staff and students wouldn't travel between those 3 local authorities to get to their workplace caused us all sorts of issues in terms of communication of those messages, and it would have been, again, in retrospect, much simpler if there had just been a standard approach to that, because it caused a great deal of anxiety, because throughout COVID people wanted to get it right, and largely people were compliant, so they would, you know, go way over the top in terms of making sure that they understood what it was they should be doing and what they shouldn't be doing. All adds to the anxiety, and I think lasting mental or lack of mental resilience that we now have in our staff and student tiers, student body, sorry.
Thank you very much. Mr. Vincent, if we could come to you next then.
Thank you. I completely endorse what my 2 colleagues have so far said, so I'll try not to repeat too much. I think the balance of harm's point is quite an interesting one. We were working with other settings, both types of educational setting and commercial settings, and our students and staff were enjoying other settings who were observing quite different rules than we were operating to, and that made life very, very difficult indeed. Maintaining a set of rules in an institution with people who were quite confused about if they're in college they're meant to be following one set of rules, but if they at lunchtime go across the road to a cafe they'll be following a different set of rules, and that was very difficult. As the chief executive principal of an organisation, you're often looked to provide authoritative advice. And as Stella's identified, we have particular legal duties around health and safety. It was very difficult to provide that authoritative advice. We'd often receive the guidance at the same time that everybody else was receiving the guidance. There was no early release so that we could look at it and sense check it and understand what it was for our context. And sometimes we were receiving copies of documentation that were quickly going out of date, and we were being told by our trade union colleagues that actually that was the wrong version and that they were aware that there was a new one coming. That's a really difficult position because you want to try and inspire a degree of confidence. One last point, the Scottish Government's strategic framework and the tiers approach that Angela's identified. I think I'm correct in saying that the Greater Glasgow area enjoyed more in and out of college than any other part of Scotland. It was very difficult to predict as transmission rates accelerated and decelerated as to whether in a week or two's time whether the campuses would be open or not. That was enormously destabilising for staff and for students. because frequently those tier system didn't particularly affect the rest of their lives. It was unhelpful, and I mean this in no value judgment about COP26. But as we approached COP26, Glasgow went into a higher level tier to try and reduce transmission rates before society locked down across COP, and then we had a further lockdown thereafter that affected our students. Our students couldn't get to college, and that was largely because of the choice to operate COP and the consequences of that. And while no way am I criticising that decision, it had lasting consequences for the operations of colleges.
Thank you very much. And then Ms. Roma, if we could come to you.
Yeah, again, I think my colleagues have very amply kind of described the situation applying to all of us, and I think you've heard the sense of fundamental frustration that we all experienced during that period. And I think the point that John was making there last about the unpredictability of rulings that came, whether a college had to close down again or was able to remain open kind of in certain circumstances, really kind of caused a lot of that there was not often a perceivable rationale for our students in particular and stakeholders. So it all translated, particularly in the second phase of of the pandemic, to sort of, that college opening wasn't reliable and the ability to go to college. So, as I said earlier, we lost a lot of students, particularly from 2020-21 onwards, who just didn't stay with the college system. And the opening and closing, and not having sort of a more reliable way of understanding, what the college would be able to provide in its physical premises, that led to students actually choosing just to leave. And and some, students may have been lost to education forever. They might not actually come back. But I think there was just not enough consultation with the college sector on what physical premises actually looked like. The 5% rule was imposed on all of us in terms of 5% of students, and we had to make difficult choices. Quite often it was in favour of practical kind of courses and students attached to that, or students of particular risk who had to be brought in. But set against that, at some stages, students were able to go to a nightclub or a pub, but they weren't able to go to their college and their local library. It seemed just quite strange in reflection. So. And then, in addition, as a college with 10 centres, the tiered system kind of meant, that sometimes, the travel issue, college, students and staff travelling from one area to another, just, they travelled in different tiered kind of areas and then had to behave differently. Like others have said, with a large school college activity, as a college, there was complete lack of understanding from school pupils and their parents and their teachers, I have to say, why different rules applied to coming back on campus, and actually being able to enforce behaviour in line with the regulations was sometimes very challenging, particularly when social distancing had to be maintained. So how do you, physically separate people when actually you need to be distant from them? Last thing is a point that Stella made about trade unions. Much was made about ventilation and monitoring oxygen levels in classrooms when colleges were able to reopen. Schools were furnished eventually with monitors, oxygen monitors or carbon monoxide monitors, and it took quite a long time for colleges then also to be given funds to purchase these. But that was at the time quite an essential sort of reassurance measure for our staff also to be able to go back into colleges, because the anxiety about standing back in closed environments, particularly in the winter when you can't open windows, particularly in the Highlands and Islands, you know, was quite high. So so even you know, small measures like air quality indicators, ventilation, were very important, but they were used elsewhere in the world much earlier, and we could have had potentially a return to campuses also much earlier using, you know, other tried and tested methods.
Thank you very much. Now, I'm conscious we have 12 minutes left, so I think we have 3 minutes left for each of you, and I do want to give you an opportunity to touch on any potential lessons to be learned, but we do have one more topic. So perhaps I can ask you, and the last topic was impacts on principals, colleges and staff, and I think we've touched on a number of those already through the discussion, so including, for example, financial impacts on colleges, impacts on work-life balance, difficulty of making decisions that could impact on others, difficulty getting people back into work, any ongoing impacts, and any other relevant key issues. So if I could perhaps ask you each in turn to make any comments that you have on impacts on principals, colleges and staff, additional ones that you want to make, but also in the course of your discussion, just also touch on any potential lessons to be learned, good or bad. And perhaps so we can just work down the line, starting with Ms. Cox and followed by Mr. Vincent, Ms. Roma and Ms. McManus.
So I think we've touched on most of what I would want to say, but the one thing for me is the perceived lack of value of what colleges do and the role that our staff play. So we had issues around gaining key worker status, and we've talked about why some of those staff needed to come into college and do that role. There's also an issue around school teachers being paid additional for assessments, and college lecturers weren't. And a challenge around those sort of working hours boundaries and what we were expecting of our staff at that time. Under potential lessons to be learned, I think it's about understanding the diversity of the sector. You know, we're 24 institutions, all very, very different in what we do. We're not schools, we're not universities, and we serve the needs of our communities and regions. And that really wasn't understood. And for me, it would be, and I understand, you know, hindsight is a great thing, but that direct communication and understanding with those accountable officers, college principals, would perhaps have led to better decision making rather than hearing things second and third hand. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Vincent.
Thank you. I mean, clearly it was a very intense and at times overwhelming period for everybody associated with the running and the studying in colleges. I think I'll just focus my comments on, in addition to trying to run an operation that was about teaching and learning and assessment and all of the pressures that go along with that, there was long periods of uncertainty about some really basic, what I might call institutional hygiene matters, about our finances as colleges, how our funding system would work, clawback of funds, things that are really fundamental to the operation of an organisation, which you can't ignore. But really, when you're trying to focus on running one in the midst of a pandemic, were probably unhelpful that we went for as long as we did. Quite frequently, we would try to make contacts with some of the key agencies that have responsibility for the college sector, only to find them either unavailable or overwhelmed by the situations they were facing too. And so that was really difficult. I think what I was left with, and maybe it's a lesson learnt for somebody, is really the lack of understanding and appreciation of how colleges work, our operating model, the unique challenges we face, our types of students and their lived experiences. That became, I think we'd always thought that might be an issue. During the pandemic, decisions were being made that showed a lack of understanding in some very senior levels of civil service and agencies that brought that home with perfect clarity. And that continues to this day.
Thank you very much. Mr. Roma.
I would totally concur with what Angela and John have said, so I will not repeat that. Maybe if I can put a slightly different spin on what has been, largely sort of negative impacts. There have been other positive impacts of the COVID pandemic. It forced everyone online. So as a college that operates in the Highlands and Islands, and in a world that's very dominated by in-person meetings in the Central Belt, actually it forced everyone to look at how communication could take place online. And for a while after the pandemic, actually, that was an equalizer. So rural and island communities quite often have the additional cost of travelling long distances to the places of decision in the Central Belt. So, but perhaps the lesson to learn is to hold on actually to that equalisation and to build that into mainstream business going forward. There has been a backlash to online learning and also online meeting kind of post-pandemic and with people going back to pre-pandemic behaviours. But with that, the capacity for online learning in the sector has certainly increased and continues to be invested in, and that in itself kind of increases access to learning. But I mean, that is offset by some of the longer term issues that we've described and the mental health impact and scarring. So the support, I think, of a sector that quite often is not well understood, as my colleagues have said, and that sits in the shadow of school and university sectors. It's really important that government understands our sector better, how our estates operate, how important we are as anchor institutions for our communities, that the value of the colleges quite often goes well beyond just learning and teaching and skills, but actually is the go-to institution for some of the most deprived students and members of our community. And actually in forward planning the strength of the sector and ensuring continuity of the operation of the sector for potentially any future pandemic should be planned for now and not left to the next pandemic.
Thank you very much. And finally, Ms McManus.
I'm not sure I've got much more to add from what my colleagues have said, which I fully agree with, really. But the first part, the impact. I don't think when you to try to quantify or to put a qualitative spin on the sheer impact on the staff and students at the college sector was tremendous. And I think that the lessons to be learned from this is, I'm now at the point where I don't actually think it's acceptable or good enough for the government or civil service to turn around and say that they don't know what a college does. I don't think that's acceptable anymore. So that's the lesson I think that really has to be taken away from here, that we are a pivotal point of the education system. It's key to providing both young people and with adults an opportunity to progress on to a job of their choosing, a future or future study of their choosing. And I think it's something that I think that that we now, that I hope now government understands that, but I worry that they don't really. And I think ultimately that moving forward, really, the main ask for me would be that when something like this happens or something additional that may happen going forward, it's about if they consult with us, if people are talking to the college leaders, they consult and they listen. And I think that's an important word in all of this, is that they need to listen to what the experts in the sector are actually saying. And I think that's something for me that, if nothing else from this, that we need to listen to what those lessons have been for all of us. And I think, as Lydia said, the positivity of some of this in terms of what lessons we have already learned. We have got hybrid working in place now. We are listening to staff around that. We are putting courses online that work online, but making sure that our staff have got the training and support in which to deliver that also. So I think that those are some of the sort of key things for me, in addition to what my colleagues have said.
Well, thank you very much, all of you, for your participation. My Lord, I don't have any further questions unless your Lordship does, and we have 2 minutes to spare.
4 minutes. I won't use them up. Yes, Thank you, Ms van der Westhausen, and thank all panel members for participating. We're very grateful. That brings an end to today's session. We will be back tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. Thank you very much.
Thank you, my lord.